Now that the basic layout of our extension is in place, let's start adding some functionality to it. And the first thing I think we'll want to tackle is this task list, since it's kind of self-contained in the pop-up and we won't have to deal with any background scripts just yet. So what we probably want to happen when we hit this add task button is for rows like this to appear all the way down the page. And they'll pretty much be identical to this layout. And the way we're going to want to do that is through JavaScript. What we're going to need to do is create an ID for this add task button so we can access it. Same for this one, for the start timer. We'll need that later on. And also for this container, we'll just call this task container. Because what we're going to do is we'll be generating these input elements and then appending them as children to this task container. So I'll save this HTML file. We'll head up into our pop-up. And the first thing we're going to do is get a reference to our add task button. Element by ID. And name of that add task again. And we'll add a listener to it. Add event listener. We'll listen for a click event. And on this click event, we're going to call it an add task function. We haven't written yet, but we'll do that right below. An add task. And the way you create elements in pure JavaScript is just with a document.createElement. So we're going to begin by creating our task row, and we're actually going to wrap these input elements inside of a div. So we'll begin by creating that div, create element div, and then now we can create the actual text input. So we'll do const text document, create element, and this one's an input field. And the input type equals text, and we'll give it a placeholder, something like enter a task, but just a little more flavorful. And next we'll create our delete button, which isn't actually a button element, it's an input element. Type of the delete button equals the button, and then we'll also give it a value x, so that actually ends up looking like this delete button. And now that we've created our two input elements, we want to append them as children to our task row. So the task row append child, and the order does matter here. We're going to append our text element first, and then append our delete button. And now that our task row is a div with two children, being the input fields, we'll have to actually attach it to the container. So get a reference, get task container. We'll do task container dot append child task row. So creating a container div for our task row, the two input elements, and then appending it to the task container. So when we reopen this pop-up and we hit add task, we can see that we're creating a bunch of these rows and they're all the same. You can type in them, you can click on these buttons, but they don't really do too much right now. And just to make things a little more clean, I'm going to get rid of this placeholder. Open this back up, add a couple of tasks. Cool, looking good. So one thing we probably want to do is we probably want to store the text that users add in these input fields to some sort of data structure so that we can keep track of it and also save it in storage later on. And the most obvious way to do that is probably in an array. So if we actually inspect this, we can see the current formatting is our container followed by these divs with the two input fields. And we'll notice that these are actually ordered from the first task all the way down to the last task. So we can actually use an array to track the values in each of these divs and to also track the task position. So if we had an array at index 0 and we want to access the very first task, we would go to index 0. And if we want to go to the very last task, we'd go to the end of the array. Let's create this task array. Let's call it tasks. We'll make an empty array for now. And what we're going to do is add an event listener onto our input field. And anytime the value changes actually inside of this field, what we'll do is callback function. Well, actually, the first thing we need to do is when we create a new task, we actually need to append a value to our task array. So we'll do that right at the top. We'll do task dot push, and we'll just push in an empty string because every task should begin with no real value. What we're going to do is on change is we'll need to get the task number actually of this so that we can access the array directly to update its value. So in order to get that, we'll actually get the length of the array. Because, for example, if this is the very first task, then the index of it, when we push it in, will be 0. And the current length of the task array is 0. So we can actually just say const task length is equal to task.length. So when this changes, what we're going to do is go into our task array, task length, and set that equal to text.value. And I'll just console.log our entire task array so that we can make sure this is updating correctly. And that looks pretty good for now. Alright, I'm actually going to change this to be task num. It's a little more descriptive. I'll just copy that over there. Okay, cool. So if we open our task, click add task a bunch of times, we create a couple of tasks. And then if I enter something like A here, you can see it. Like, on change, we have an array with all 3 of our tasks. And the first one says A. And then if we do something like C here, we'll see that the last element gets updated. So now we have a data structure that's tracking all the values. When we delete something, it should also be deleted in our array. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Get rid of this console.log. And as you might guess, in order to delete a task, we'll do the very similar thing. We'll add an event listener. Delete button event listener. Except this time, this one will be on click. And what we'll do is, so in JavaScript, to actually remove something, we actually use the splice method. So task.splice, we pass in the index, which will again be task num, and then the number of elements we want to remove, and which will just be 1 in this case. If we do that and add a bunch of tasks, say 1, 2, 3, 4, and we actually hit this delete, we'll notice that nothing has actually happened here. Like, these aren't being removed. And that's pretty much due to the fact that we're not re-rendering when we remove this from the task, right? We're removing the string, but we're not updating any of the DOM elements. So in order for this delete to actually work properly, we need to re-render DOM elements after splicing this. The way we should do that is actually, we should now separate the logic for adding tasks to this task array from the render logic of actually adding something to the DOM. Because the easiest way to delete a task is actually to remove it from the task array and then re-render everything inside of it. That way we don't have to traverse through this entire task container. We don't have to traverse through all the children of the task container, find our matching task, and remove that single div.